Now let's shift our attention to group policy. And group policy is something, first of all, you can be guaranteed they will ask quite a few questions about on the exam. But group policy also kind of ties up in the real world kind of the Active Directory design idea. Now let's, first of all, we're going to go over just a bunch of basics in this video. First question is, what exactly is group policy? The best way to think about group policy is it is a means of managing the entire Active Directory organization from a central place. And what's really cool about this is we are going to think through the settings. We're going to configure a setting once, and we're basically going to save it, if you want to think of it this way, in a text file. And then we're going to apply it to one or more computers. And then we're going to automate the application of that setting. So basically we're going to collect a bunch of settings into like a text file. And then we're going to group computers based on domains, based on organizational units, based on sites. And then we're going to say anybody in this particular organizational unit gets all these settings when they log in or when the computer starts up or so forth. It's an ingenious idea. There are over 2,000 settings that can be adjusted or that can be manipulated through Active Directory. There's just a lot of things you can do here. It's almost unlimited what you can accomplish with group policy and Active Directory. Now, this right here is what I want you to really concentrate on and burn into your brain, so to speak. Site, domain, and OU, organizational unit. That's the priority of how group policy objects or group policies are added to an Active Directory organization. They go first at the site, then the domain, and then the organizational unit. Now, anything that we set at the site, if it's changed, the domain side, when it gets to the domain, it will override that. Then when it gets to the organizational unit, it will override it, and it just kind of keeps going down that way, closer and closer and closer to the end user. The settings for group policy are contained, I mentioned a text box a little earlier in this video, and the correct nomenclature for where they're stored is a group policy object. And then once we create this group policy object that is really nothing more than a list of all the settings that need to be set, we then link or point that object to a site, a domain, or an organizational unit. And then any computers or users inside those particular Active Directory objects get those settings manipulated. Now, when we link an object to a site, domain, or OU, we can tell it to make the settings to either the computers or the users. Now on the computers, we can tell it that when the computer starts up to make certain settings. On a user, we can say when the user logs on. Now let me show you a diagram here of what I'm talking about. And I want you to get this image in your mind, and you will be able to take care of most of the questions on the exam. Notice SDOU. Always remember that. Now let's say that we have an Active Directory domain, and we have an organizational unit with a domain controller in it, and then we have another organizational unit with maybe another domain controller and some file and print servers and whatever else we've got. And then we've got another organizational unit with another domain controller maybe and some users. And then two of them are in a site different from the rest of the domain. Two of the organizational units are. Now, if we apply group policy to this domain, and this is just a generic idea here, but group policy first gets applied at the site level. And then, once the site settings are made, then the domain settings are made. Then any group policies that apply to the organizational units get applied. And that is the way it goes, site, domain, OU. Now, in the real world, the way this usually works out is that we've got a domain and we've got a site. But let me say something about sites. It's rare that people in the real world will use sites as a basis for group policy, because sites are tied to the physical subnets on your network. Those can change. People can inadvertently be moved from one to the other on a network reorganization. So if you want to use sites, go for it. In the real world, you'll kind of see them less commonly used, but you can still use them. So ultimately, this is probably what you want to do with your Active Directory organization, and this is the way most are set up. At the site level, we will have a group policy object that sets parameters that everybody in the site needs. If this were the default first site name and we didn't have another site, that would be really cool. Because let's say we could establish a password policy that everybody gets no matter what, and we can invoke that at the site level. Well, in reality, that's usually what happens at the domain level. You'll have a domain level group policy object that gets applied at that domain level, and then you will actually set group policies for your OUs. And notice a lot of times you'll have multiple OUs, and so there may be something you want set differently for users in this OU than users in this OU, and so forth. Then you get the question of nested OUs. What if there's an OU inside here? Well, you can apply a different group policy to that, but you do need to keep in mind that even on this, let's say on this OU right here, keep in mind this group policy object got applied to these machines because they're in this site. Then this group policy object, these settings got applied to these machines because they're in the domain that it's linked to. And then this group policy got applied because it is linked to that organizational unit. If you can keep that straight in your mind, you can figure out most anything on these group policies. Site, domain, OU, that's the order of processing. And that's a real good basic look at group policy. I hope that helps.